And the recording started now. I'll close the recording later and you can ask any personal things that you might want to ask that you don't want recorded for the whole class to know. So what are we going to do today? Well, you should be slowly finishing up with module one. I know we said this is a flexible learning environment. Maybe you're taking a bit longer. Maybe you're already at the end of module two. That doesn't matter that much, but I'm trying to keep you on track more or less by saying that this is kind of where we need to recap module one. So most of the concepts that we talk about here should be familiar. I've designed some activities for us to do to try and probe our understanding. What I do want you to do is when you feel like something isn't clear and you just want to catch up on it, or you want me to expand or use a different example, etc., just raise your hand, type it in the chat, interrupt me, whatever you need to do. These are the opportunities that you have to get some of this stuff clarified. So you can find these tutorial slides and you'll be able to find the recordings in your content all the way at the bottom. I think it's called tutorial slides and recordings, and you can find all that information here. You'll also see there's some optional information in there for those of you who want to learn how to apply the constraints-led approach a little bit more. Please don't feel free. Don't feel like you have to do that, but feel free to fill it in, send it to me. I'll take a quick look. I'll give you some feedback and so on. So all the learning is there for you. Use what you need. So first of all, we said that a large proportion of this subject is about shifting our understanding. And we said, well, the way that it is common for people to think is to think in this linear and reductionist manner. In fact, even this morning, I still had a conversation with a colleague. Most of you would know who Steph Curry is. And he was talking about Steph Curry's shooting coach. And he said that Steph Curry's shooting coach constantly says that it's because Steph Curry works with a lot of tennis balls and does a lot of cognitive training, etc., that it is that he is so good. But of course, that is linear and reductionist thinking. We know that there are many more things that go into being a proficient shooter. It's how much talent you have, how often you can train, how often you were injured, the way you train, how you grew up, how often or how early you started doing your shooting training, and so on. So having this kind of linear reductionist thinking is not what we want in this subject. So a good understanding or a good example here is imagine that we would have laziness on one side and physical activity on the other. And this is a very commonly formulated argument by people, right? Sorry, just letting Ricky in. A very commonly formulated argument. They say, well, as you get lazier, your physical activity level goes down. And they say that is because lazy people aren't physically active. Of course, we now know that that is a hugely reductionist way of thinking because imagine this example. I'm going to ask you to unmute later, type in the chat, whatever's most comfortable for you. But imagine this example. You have a client, but that client is skipping the gym because they recently changed their work and getting used to a new workplace means long hours and high fatigue. And those interact and they make resting rather than exercising a more stable behavior for the system. So when your client is skipping the gym, you can do two things. You can think, well, I wonder if my client's just being lazy. They're not showing up to practice because they're lazy. Because they're lazy, their physical activity will drop and they will get even lazier. Or you can think, well, I wonder what the context of this problem is like. I wonder what the system around this problem looks like. Right? So what I want you to do now is I want you to look at this example. And I know you don't have the exact answer, and you don't have to have the exact answer. I don't have it either. But I'd like you to think about what would an intervention for a client like this look like once you remove that reductionist and linear thinking from your thought process and you think of it more in the complex or in the context of a system. What would you think? How would you design an intervention that would make your client, this particular client who just changed their workplace, more physically active? I'll give you a second to think. You can type or unmute. And if you don't know, just throw something out there. All right, we've got something in the chat. Let's have a look. All right, so Ricky says, well, what we could do is we could take into account the fact that this person has a particular system, right? And they've just changed work. So let's try and get some micro doses of exercise in before work and when they're really fresh. And I think that's good, right? What you've just done, if you is you've Ricky, you've reduced your reductionist, linear, simplistic thinking, and you've thought of this as a system. And to intervene in a system, you have to find the small areas in which small interventions can likely make the largest difference. So that's very good. Then let's take a look at what Morgan says. Morgan says, getting them to park further away and walk to work, increasing their step count. And this is really good. This is what's called encouraging incidental physical activity. You're not necessarily designing an intervention because when you do that with someone who's really busy, what they do is they go, but then I have to put on my clothes, have to drive to the gym, I have to spend at least an hour there, and that's going to mess up, how my boss thinks of me. So what you're doing is you're encouraging this incidental physical activity. They park further away, and gradually you may increase their physical activity until maybe perhaps they are again ready for the gym. Great thinking, Morgan. Um, no. That's fine, Ricky. Focus on driving, and I think this is really good. Your suggestion was really good. So based on what Ricky and Morgan identified, is there anyone else who can think of an intervention or a type of intervention, something creative, something interesting that you could do with this client?
You could adjust their workout or whatever you've given them so they can do it at home, or similar to what Ricky said, make it shorter or like a lighter load.
Yeah, very good. Let's take, for example, at home, right? It reduces the need to go to the gym. It means that you can spend less time outside of the workplace. You can do a big work day, impress your boss, whatever is relevant to them, and then still do a quick, short, and punchy workout at home. So, what I'm demonstrating to you here is that if you think simplistically and in a linear, reductionist manner, you can never find solutions to complex problems. The trap here is that we love, as humans, we love thinking about really complex problems and finding simple solutions to them. It just doesn't work that way, right? And I hope that as part of this first module, this is something that you've learned. Now, as we move on to the next section, there's a little bit of background I have to tell you here. So for the last 5 years, I've been involved with an NBA team working with particularly shooting, doing coach education, but also interventions with shooters. So this is particularly kind of close to my heart, right? And one of the things that we talked about is that behavior emerges from countless interactions between the subcomponents of the complex system, right? That means that, for example, someone who shoots the ball, whether that's Shaquille O'Neal or 100 other basketball players, each one of these players finds a solution to the problem that you pose to them in a very individual way. They find a way that works for them. That's why you see such varying shooting techniques in the NBA. It's why you see such varying running techniques in a 100-meter sprint. It's why you see such varying motivational drivers for people who exercise. There are so many solutions to the same problem based on how the subcomponents of a system can organize. So my question to you is, if you were me, right, you were working with these NBA teams, when would you intervene to change the shooting behavior of a highly expertful shooter? I'll give you an example that I encountered, for example, is teams will come to me and say, well, this shooter is shooting only 20% from three. We want them to become a better shooter. How would you, or when would you intervene? Would you say, yeah, that's fine. give them to me, I'll work with them? Or would you say, oh, maybe this is not the right time, the right player, and so on? So give me some information.
I think it depends on. Sorry to interrupt. I think it's depending on
Mhm.
what they're going through. Like you've got to kind of do a little bit of a background check almost and see how they're coping with things in their own life before you can really sit them down and kind of like ask those questions about, hey, how are you in kind of like your life, your personality? Are you going through some sort of slump? Like, what's the reasoning behind your kind of the changes in your in predictability in your game, if that makes sense. So if you're like playing if you're having a lower percentage of shooting from a certain point, like let's say the 3 point line, well, if that's their normal area of getting their highest rate of scores or percentages, and that's obviously you need to take on point of that. But again, it's like if the person is better at doing layups or doing a different kind of scoring method, then it's like, well, that shouldn't be something I would consider as important because it's not the way that they play the game.
Yeah, and I think that's good. So you've raised a few good points here. First of all, is you've moved away, and I don't know if you noticed yourself doing it, but you moved away from linear reductionist thinking. A linear way of thinking would be here, or you would say, well, the one thing that determines whether your shot goes in or not is the technique. It's the coordination pattern you use to shoot. But of course, there's much more to that, right? If someone has troubles in their personal life, maybe their father or mother passed away, they're just not in it, then maybe this is just a temporary slump and no intervention needs to be designed. On the other hand, you identified a really good thing is, well, maybe this person, after thousands and thousands and thousands of hours of practice, is not actually a very good three-point shooter. Maybe they're good at other things, right? Their system degrees of freedom, their system components organize in a more efficient way in other skills than they do in, for example, three-point shooting. Um, Ricky says if output or technique fundamentals are down and without any variables externally or multifaceted issues. Yeah, so I think that's a good point. That probably relates back to what James said before. If this shooter usually shoots 40% from three, and all of a sudden they're on a 5 game streak shooting 20% from three, maybe then it is worth intervening. But I would, and I'll tell you a little anecdote. One of the teams I worked with, they just recruited a 7'1", which is, for those of you unfamiliar with kind of with basketball, it is extremely tall, not just very tall, but extremely tall. It's probably in the 99.99th percentile of humans, let alone athletic humans. And they just recruited a 7'1" basketball player who isn't a very good shooter. He's been practicing since he was 6 years old, just not a very good shooter. And they came to me and they said, well, what can you do to make them a better shooter? And I said, well, unfortunately, if they've been shooting since they were 5 and they are still not good, it means that their system components haven't organized in such a way that it makes them an efficient shooter. And there's very little I can do in terms of an intervention to all of a sudden go from a poor shooter with those kind of mechanics to a really good shooter. So this is just to show you that when you think about applied sports psychology, whether it's skill development, whether it's motivational interventions, whether it's physical activity interventions, performance optimization, adherence, and so on, unless you think of these problems as complex problems, you're probably not really getting to the root of the problem. The intervention you design gets absorbed by the system rather than changing it. So now if you move to, sorry, just moving some boxes around, move to the next part. What we said is that ultimately what you want to create is you want to create dynamic and adaptable exercises because humans are complex, dynamical, adaptive systems. Right? So when we think of the exercising behavior of any individual, then we know that the things that motivate, that drive them, that optimize performance today may not be the things that optimize performance tomorrow. We have to take into account the dynamics of behavior. we have to take into account that behavior is functionally variable. What that means is that when you want someone who's skilled, or you want someone who's resilient or robust against pressure, you don't just want them to be robust in one single context. You want them to be robust in a variety of contexts. And unless you address that variety of contexts in your intervention, it's really difficult to make them functionally variable, or for that matter, on the other side, adaptive. Right? So we want someone who can adapt to all of the outside context, to all of the constraints, and we want them to be able to do that in a functionally variable way. We want them to be able to do that in a way that solves the problem at hand. Now, I was amazed. I've read some really cool stuff, and I recognize some of the names obviously here in this tutorial, but I've read some really cool stuff from you on reinforcing and stabilizing feedback loops. Because what we discussed in module 1 is that when you move away from that linear causal thinking, right? A causes B, and therefore if I intervene on A, B will change, right? When you move away from that and you think more in terms of positive or reinforcing feedback loops, or negative or stabilizing feedback loops. And I think that's important here. A negative feedback loop doesn't have to have a negative outcome. It can just not improve the actual outcome. We'll look at some examples in a second. Once you start thinking in the context of that, and you start thinking in the context of nonlinearity, which means that small changes that you make in the system can lead to very large results, you can see how you can start intervening at specific points in these feedback loops to optimize how far your resources will go. There is no point spending billions on trying to change someone's behavior and changing it by a very small amount. We're trying to look for small interventions that have really large effects. So I just wrote down some different examples of feedback loops here. So this is, for example, on the right-hand side is an example of a positive feedback loop. And I think some of you identified it in the asynchronous tutorial as well. Imagine that your training intensity increases. That has a positive effect on your physical fatigue. Your physical fatigue increases as well. Your need for homeostasis increases too. That triggers the need for recovery. Sorry, this is a negative or stabilizing feedback loop, not a positive one, right? And that in turn has a negative effect on the training intensity that you can deal with in the next practice session. So this loop, ultimately, if you follow it, it stabilizes the training intensity. It slowly decreases them to a stabilizing point. On the other hand, if we look at a positive or reinforcing feedback loop, then we can see that, for example, if your enjoyment increases, that increases how motivated you are to exercise. That as a result, you put more effort in and you participate more. And that leads to better adherence. Because you adhere to your exercise, you enjoy it more. Because you enjoy it more, you again increase motivation and so on. So once you start thinking rather than a linear A causes B model, you start thinking in these feedback loops, all of a sudden it raises all kinds of interesting ways to design interventions. Because here in this feedback loop, right, or in this one, in the stabilizing feedback loop, we can design interventions on any one of these components. We can, for example, give them better nutrition so they recover faster. Right? Or we can ensure that their rest is of higher quality, or we can decrease the training intensity, etc. So there are all kinds of ways in which you can intervene in this feedback loop. That gives you the opportunity to figure out, well, what is the thing I can intervene in that has the smallest or requires the smallest amount of resources, but has the greatest effect at the back end. In the same way, if you wanted to decrease someone's intrinsic motivation, you could also understand which part of the feedback loop you would have to intervene in. Or if you wanted to accelerate someone's intrinsic motivation, for example, they're currently in a little dip and you want to figure out how you get them intrinsic motivation for an upcoming race in 3 weeks, for example, then you can do that using these feedback loops. It just gives you a much broader perspective on the problem of performance or adherence, and it gives you a better understanding of how you can intervene. So what I've done is I'll share the whiteboard with you in a second, but you'll see I've done something really simple. I've created two variables. One is enjoyment, which is on the left-hand side of the screen, and then adherence on the right-hand side of the screen. So what I'll do is I'll send you away for a little second, and I'm sending you away because I don't need that. I don't think that every bit of discussion you do should be something that I'm always hearing. I know that sometimes it's easier to talk when I'm not there. So I want you to get in your groups for about 5 minutes and want you to discuss some positive or negative, so reinforcing or stabilizing feedback loop that starts with enjoyment and finishes with adherence. And then hopefully, if I got it right, I'll be able to share the whiteboard with you later. You'll nominate one person within your group and they'll draw out some part of that feedback loop. And if in 5 minutes you can discuss one feedback loop, that's great. If you discuss half a feedback loop, that's great too. I just want you to spend that time on considering what are potential positive or negative, reinforcing or stabilizing feedback loops that start with enjoyment and that finish with adherence. All right. So I'm sending you away now. Write down some notes as you go. And then when you get back, I'll give you a few minutes to draw things out on the whiteboard. There we go. Welcome back. We'll just wait for the other group. Meanwhile, I'm figuring out how to get this whiteboard up. All right, so now, yes, I can see you moving around on the whiteboard. So that should work for most people. Of course, if you're in your car or somewhere else, don't worry about that. But I'd love you to write down a few things. You can use the drawing tool. You can just type, which is the little T on the left-hand side there. And you should be able to edit. If you can't, please let me know. And I'll give a few minutes for that. Morgan's going for it.
Apologies, I'm on an iPad, so this is not working for me at all. So
No, that's all right.
sorry,
We
team.
can discuss it later. Don't worry about it. I think we're seeing some good stuff. So I'm gonna try and tell the story that Morgan's group is bringing through what's written here. So enjoyment may lead to a plateau, perhaps a plateau in performance, Morgan, or in adherence. What was your group thinking? Meanwhile, Amy, keep drawing.
So we went like with, I guess, obviously training. So if they're enjoying it, but then they hit a plateau in their training. And then we said, well, if they went into a change of environment, so if they were training on their own, and hit a plateau, feeling unmotivated, changed environment, went to like a class environment instead, and then that motivated them, which then meant that they were more adherence, had more
Yes.
adherence.
Yeah. I think that's good. Maybe you haven't drawn it entirely right. This is how I would kind of draw it. Sorry,
Other way.
this way. So these are connected. And then this is really this change in environment is really the intervention, right? And I think this is really, really cool to talk about. So imagine this stabilizing feedback loop, right? And you have to imagine that it kind of goes round and round, right? Someone who's um, enjoying exercise in a certain way, but then plateaus, it decreases their motivation. It affects how much they adhere to their exercise. And then you'd have another line here, which decreases or stabilizes enjoyment, which gives more plateau, less motivation, decreases adherence, and so on. And you rightfully identified, well, you said, well, hey, wait a second. Sometimes changes in environment, for example, putting someone in a competitive or a cooperative environment, right, can really change how they interact with exercise. And that change of environment could be the small intervention you need to break the kind of stabilizing or negative cycle in that feedback loop. So great thinking, Morgan's group. And I'm saying Morgan's group, of course, I know you consisted of multiple people. And then here, Amy. So Amy saying, when you enjoy exercise, and interrupt me if I'm wrong, right? When you enjoy exercise, you practice more. When you practice more, you improve to a greater degree. When you improve to a greater degree, it decreases the challenge of competition. And then you practice less. Is that?
No. So what I was kind of saying is that you enjoy something in training, then you practice it more, whether it's a skill or yeah, you just practice, maybe it's the whole entire sport or exercise, and because you practice more, usually you see some improvement in whatever area that is. And kind of what Morgan was saying is that there's usually a challenge that comes up when I find, at least when I reach like a new level of skill, it kind of unlocks like a whole new level of understanding or challenge that I
Ah,
need to like understand. And then so I go, okay, well then I need to practice all these things that I didn't realize, I
yeah,
needed to practice. And
yeah,
then
I
because I
like that.
practice, then I do it more. So then I adhere more. But then because for me, it's like something, because I want to get better, I actually then enjoy learning all the new things and all the new challenges. If that kind of
Yes.
makes sense.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, so if people have trouble maybe following because it's a kind of a personal narrative, I think some way to also look at it is, let's say that you enjoy your activity, you practice it more, then you improve to a greater degree. Imagine you're a tennis player, right? All of a sudden that unlocks playing against much higher rated opponents because you play against much higher rated opponents. You practice more because you want to beat them too. That means you stick to practice longer, and you enjoy it more, and so on. So you get a reinforcing feedback loop. Amy, did I do that justice?
Yes, you did. That's what I
Yes.
was trying to say.
Okay. Any follow-ups from others? So I think this is great, right? And you can see how for both of these, if we close the feedback loop, then from adherence to enjoyment, you can see that it's called circular causation. It's a system that can keep itself going without needing additional input, right? As long as you create the context for that causal link or that causal loop to keep looping around, you don't have to do anything. People will just develop more adherence, more enjoyment, more adherence, more enjoyment, or less adherence, less enjoyment, less adherence, less enjoyment. And so what we really want to do is when someone has a positive or reinforcing loop, we want to encourage that positive or reinforcing loop. That's a great intervention. When someone has a negative or stabilizing loop, we want to break that negative or stabilizing loop. And that's what intervention should be designed around. Um, James says when the social interaction element emerges, it increases their motivation. Yeah, absolutely. So then, for example, right, and this is where we have to consider a constraints-based approach. Right? If someone is very prone to being motivated by social interaction with others, social interaction might increase motivation. Motivation increases adherence. Adherence increases enjoyment, and so on. But on the other hand, we should also consider that some people are not motivated by social interaction. They like practicing on their own. Therefore, an intervention where you increase social interaction may actually force them into a negative or stabilizing feedback loop. Yeah, so once you start thinking about causality in the context of loops, not linear relationships between variables, things really change in how you can design interventions. All right. Any last thing from you on that topic of feedback loops? No? If not, keep it for after class and then we can discuss it then. Um, the next thing I wanted to do, sorry, as I go to my old screen, is I want to go a little bit further. And remember, we talked about the dynamics. We also called it time variance. The dynamics of a complex dynamical system means that the state of a system changes, right? And it changes by basically jumping from this one attractor state to the next attractor state to the next attractor state. And what those attractor states are, they are stable and energy efficient, usually states of behavior that a system tends to settle into because it's comfortable. For example, you've all heard of that saying where if you do something for, and I don't know how often it is, but let's say 3 weeks, then it becomes a habit. what really is happening there is because when you repeat something very often, for example, you wake up at 6 a.m. every day to do a jog, a stable state of behavior emerges as you do that. It becomes an attractor. It becomes the most efficient way to solve the movement problem of getting exercise into your day. We also, alongside attractors, we have this thing called repellers, and they're almost the opposite. It's an unstable state that your system or the complex system tends to want to move away from. For example, a high state of anxiety before competition is a repeller, and your system, in this case, the person who has the anxiety, does everything they can to move away from it. And that could be turning high states of anxiety into laser sharp optimal focus, or letting it cause a performance dip. Whatever it is, as long as you don't have to deal with that repeller state. And then finally, the last thing that we talked about in the dynamics is this phase transition. We said that people constantly shift from one attractor state to another attractor state to another attractor state. And that happens in the context of complex dynamical systems theory. That happens in a nonlinear manner. That means as you increase a particular parameter, you can't shift someone directly out of an attractor state. Sometimes it takes a lot of effort, but then all of a sudden they will shift and they will snap out of it and they will settle into this new attractor state. This new attractor state becomes more and more stable. As it becomes more and more stable, it takes more energy to get someone out of it. And that's why it's so difficult. If you're used to not exercising at all, you've developed a stable attractor for not exercising. It takes a significant intervention and the right intervention to get someone out of that stable state and for exercise to become a new stable state. So here I use the example, a sedentary person joins the Couch to 5K, and as their fitness increases, their motivation will shift from unmotivated but struggling, like I have to go, to intrinsically motivated to exercise. Right? And that's often what the real kind of interventional driver is behind these programs. So now what I'll do is I'll launch a poll, and it's not something that gets you points or whatever, but I want you to tell me which one of these is, according to you, a repeller, right? Not an attractor, but a repeller. And you'll tell me later why that's the case. So I'll quickly launch the poll, and I want to see what you say. Have a look. You can choose multiple ones, and you can tell me which one of these are repellers. Remember, repellers are states that we want to get away from as quickly as possible. All right, we have almost everyone participated, and I think this is, everyone participated. I think this is pretty clear here that you think that there's two repellers here. Thinking about the gym, but staying on the couch, and feeling extreme pre-game anxiety. Who wants to take the word, tell us why you chose what you chose? Why is that a repeller and not an attractor?
Okay, I'll start.
Yeah, James.
Second one, thinking about the gym but staying on the couch. Again, you talked about habits, especially with kind of your motivation and your kind of way of willing yourself to get into habit forming. I think that obviously a lot of people procrastinate, especially when they go into the gym or they start programs, for example. Everyone knows that thing, that the New Year's resolution thing. How many times have you seen someone start a New Year's resolution, going to the gym, and they stay there for a month and then they eat or they leave? The third one, feeling extreme pre-game anxiety. I think everyone at any point has had anxiety, whether in a sport game or whether in the gym and stuff like that. There's so many social elements that can create that anxiety for a lot of people. For example, women going into the weight section of a gym. That's a really big prime example. A lot of people do especially feel that anxiety, which obviously decreases their motivation to continue doing it or to repel them from actually going and doing it at all.
Correct. Very good, James. And just to take the last example that James used, and I'll ask I'll ask the rest to chime in a second, but that feeling extreme anxiety, for example, when you go in the weight section of a gym, and that could be females going in the weight section, could be if you're very inexperienced and you go in the weight section. It is a repeller because what you will do is you will do anything you can to get out of that particular context or state. So, for example, you say, but I'll just do cardio then, or I'll go to the beginner's weight section, which is somewhere else. So I'll do body weight exercise, or in the worst case scenario, I'll stay home then, right? Repellers are things that push us away from the behaviors that could be attractors. What do the others think of James's discourse? Any additions? No? All right. So very good. Thanks, James. And I think that thinking about the gym but staying on the couch, if I would have just said staying on the couch or being inactive on your couch, that's probably an attractor. It's comfortable, right? It's something that we like doing, etc. But when you're thinking about the gym, but actually sitting on the couch, it demonstrates that it's a repeller. It's a behavior we want to get away from. Otherwise, we wouldn't be thinking about the gym, but staying on the couch. So very good. All of you got that right, or the entire class got that right. Let me just stop that share. And then the last thing that I wanted to discuss here, or that we discussed in the context of module 1, is that concept of metastability. And metastability can sometimes be difficult to understand because we talked about attractors and we talked about repellers. And we said, well, attractors are kind of good most of the time. They're a way in which our system, our complex system, has found a way to organize itself with the least energy demand, with the least resource, etc. But of course, attractor states can be bad and they can be good, right? An attractor for physical inactivity is bad, but an attractor for physical activity is good. But the issue with attractors is that the more stable the attractor becomes, the more difficult it is to pull someone out of that behavior. Think of the 7'1" athlete that I said before, who's been shooting in a particular way since they were 5 years old. And I've now been asked, can you change their shooting behavior? Well, that's become such a stable attractor that it will take so much resource and so much energy to pull them out of that behavior. And we don't know what we are replacing that attractor with. It could be even worse behavior. It's not necessarily better behavior, right? So what we sometimes look for is we look for something called the metastability. And I call it the Goldilocks zone of performance or adherence, because metastability is a stable state, but it's weakly stable. That means it's stable enough to get the job done, but when it doesn't work, we can discard it and try another metastable state, right? We don't have to do this activity, but I recommend you think about this at home. Give an example of where stability is negative. For example, if an attractor is stuck in a state that is too stable. We've given some examples here, but again, you can think about that at home. Then we also talked about constraints and constraints as causes for action. And we said that behavior emerges from that interplay of constraints. And ultimately, what we want to be as practitioners in applied sports psychology is we want to be designers of environments. That means we want to be able to control the constraints that get certain behaviors to self-emerge. That can be behaviors related to adherence to activity, can be behaviors related to performance. And we already talked about this circular causality, and then the slaving principle, which was part of the course content, which really describes that process of self-organization. The order parameter or the particular behavior is influenced by its parts, and the parts in turn influence the behavior influences the parts influences the behavior, so it becomes this circular causality or this feedback loop, which we already discussed. The last activity that I want you to think about is the following. Well, first, we talked about the fact that if we want to intervene, we are going to intervene through something called the constraints-led approach. We are going to manipulate features in the environment, features related to the task or features related to the individual that allow us to get certain behaviors to self-organize in that feedback loop without requiring additional input from us. Because think about it this way. If you want to make a difference in someone's life, you can't stand next to them 24/7. You have to design environments in which their behavior, the behavior that you want, is sustained through a feedback loop without you necessarily always being there to motivate them, to tell them what to do, and so on. So we encourage self-organization, and the facilitator, which is us, becomes the designer of the environment in which they get the behavior that they want, or in which we get the behavior that we are looking for as facilitators. So in terms of an activity, right, what I want you to do is in the chat, anyone you can think of, type one task constraint and one environmental constraint that you could modify in some way or another way to accelerate the learning of a layup. Don't think about this step 2 yet, just step 1. In the chat, type any possible constraint that you can think of that could be, sorry, I'll just highlight this here, that could be relevant. One task constraint and one environmental constraint for people learning the layup. Yep, we've got the first one here. Walking layup, reduce the speed. Very good. Can we get a few more? It doesn't have to be right. It can be any constraint, even if it's not feasible, whatever it might be, any constraint you can think of. One thing that we can modify in practice so it would accelerate for people to learn the layup. Understanding the rules of basketball, right? Which is a task constraint. Very good. Yeah, do it with eyes closed so they know how to do it without looking. Yeah, layup with eyes closed. That again is, that in this case would be an environmental constraint. We reduce the amount of ambient information that they can get. Good, Claire. Any more? I'll give it half a minute. Reduce the dribbling, no dribbling. Yeah, reduce the dribbling or no dribbling. Very good, Renee. I'll give you one more minute in case you're typing. All right. So now you can either type in the chat or unmute yourself. But I want to know from you, take one of the constraints that was talked about, any one of those, and tell me which behavior. Imagine that you are a coach and you're applying that constraint. Which specific behavior do you expect to see as a result of the constraint modification that you've made? So pick any one of those that was typed in the chat and tell me how behavior of the learners would change as a result of implementing that constraint. It can be your own, that's fine too.
I think the walking layup or reducing the dribble would do the accuracy, more accuracy.
Yes. Yeah, because you don't have to do what?
What's that? Sorry?
Because why do you think the
Oh, because
accuracy would increase?
it slows the movement down, it allows them to think more and kind of aim a little bit better, I guess. I don't know how to.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think your argument is good. If you don't have to focus any attention on dribbling, where can you maximize the focus on actually doing the layup?
The
So I think
shooting.
your understanding is good. You make a constraint modification, and the constraint modification leads to a certain behavior. Now, what you have to think about in the context of a constraints-led approach is this the behavior that I want to see? If it's a beneficial behavior, right? For example, in this case, players score more. As a result of players scoring more, they will try harder in the practice exercise, which leads to more scoring. We've created a very simple feedback loop that can sustain itself forever. Right? As long as you give it the right conditions to be sustained, it can sustain itself forever. So very good, Renee. Now, Ricky says single tasking, yeah, focusing on the layup. Very good, right? So Ricky identified the same thing here, is that you focus all of your attention on the layup. It creates more scoring. When you score more, you feel more motivated. You feel more motivated, you come back the next day to train again. And over time, that creates a positive, accelerating, reinforcing feedback loop. Very good. Someone else who wants to give one of the other ones a go? There's no wrong answers, as in everyone says that, but there's literally no wrong answers. We can just talk through it. We still have doing it with eyes closed. We still have understanding the rules of basketball or doing a walking layup.
How's my mic there, mate? Can you hear me?
Yeah,
That's awesome. I'm in the car. It's pretty stuff.
that's
The eyes closed one, good for, I guess, general proprioception and awareness, and like spatial awareness around backboard, height, ring, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, very good. So what we would see is if people close their eyes, the first thing we would see is we would see behavior that focuses much more on other senses. You have to get your information to score from somewhere. However, the tricky bit here is when you close your eyes, you probably get a decrease in how often you score. As a result of that, people might try to modify their behavior. For example, peak rather than closing their eyes, etc. So you might get a stabilizing feedback loop rather than a reinforcing one. Nonetheless, the problem itself is interesting to think about. You close your eyes, you get a certain behavior to self-organize. We didn't prescribe that behavior of focusing more on other senses, maybe rolling the ball more off the tip of the fingers. We didn't emphasize that verbally, but it is something that self-organizes naturally because we've given it the conditions to do so. Perhaps one more. Thanks, Ricky. Now that you know you can't go wrong, some pretty clever people in this class. I feel like I just gave a fist bump to someone and they didn't bump back. So all good. If you don't want to do the next one, that's all fine. So what we'll do here is we'll stop the share, and I'll also stop the recording, and I'll give you an opportunity. We don't have to finish exactly at 12, but if you need to go, please do go. If you want to hang behind and there's something that you still want to talk about, I'll still stay here for whatever time you still need me for. And otherwise, I'll see you in a little bit.